anyway, Dr. Dane Cook is at the VA, is a VA health science specialist. He's a physiologist, a research career scientist, and a professor of kinesiology at UW-Madison, and directs the exercise physiology laboratories there at the VA and at UW. He's been doing amazing and important work in Gulf War illness from very early on, and he's really embraced the idea of doing interdisciplinary, highly, a lot of knowledge from a single study design that he's really helped us better understand these complicated illnesses. So he uses acute and chronic exercise models and tests, using tests that challenge biologic systems. And we call that giving us a much louder signal. When you push someone that gets a little worse if they over-exercise, and you push them with a little bit of exercise, you can see what's going on there. What are the mediators, and how do those mediators make people chronically ill? It gives us new targets for treatment. It's terribly important work. His funding is funded by the NIH, by the DoD, by the VA, and I will stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. And it's been wonderful hearing everyone's talks and hearing the question and answer sessions. So my talk today, they asked me to talk about some of my pain research. So I'm going to focus on a specific subset of Gulf War veterans, those that experience chronic widespread pain, and some of the acute and chronic exercise work that we've been doing in my lab. So as a roadmap, I'm going to give you just an overview of how my lab approaches the questions that we ask. I'll talk about the acute exercise responses that we see, both behavioral and physiological. We'll talk about some of the cross-sectional work we've done looking at pain and brain relationships. And then I'll transition over to a chronic exercise training trial where we use the information that we had been learning about the acute exercise response in the brain to develop a randomized controlled trial. So in general, my lab looks at the interactions between behavior and biology and complex disease. And so we look at the influence of exercise, both acute and chronic, as I said, physical activity on physiological processes, brain health and behavior. But I want to stress that what we're really interested in is if we manipulate physiology, can we better explain behavior? So we're looking at different physiological interactions as well as how they interact with symptoms and physical activity. My focus of the talk today will be pain, but we also study fatigue, cognition, and post-exertional malaise. And I will be focusing on our Gulf War illness research, but we also study ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, Alzheimer's disease, and past and long COVID. So we use an acute exercise challenge model because much of our early research, we found lots of variability at baseline. And then when we used acute exercise challenges, we would sometimes uncover pathophysiology that was not apparent at rest. And so a typical experimental protocol for us would be we'd bring someone in at baseline, we would measure their autonomic nervous system, their central nervous system. We do a bunch of brain imaging. We would take blood samples. In several of our studies, we have looked at the gut microbiota as well. Then we would track them for about a week where we would measure their symptoms and their physical activity behaviors. We would then bring them in for an exercise challenge. In this case, it would be, for example, 30 minutes at 70% of their heart rate reserve. We would get more questionnaires. We would have them fill out more questionnaires and collect more blood samples. Then we bring them back 24 hours later when we think that their illness should be exacerbated. And what our data show us is one of the peak times. And we would repeat visit 1, and then we would track them for another 7 days. Early on, our research was motivated by this observation that those with chronic pain and fatigue reported a worsening of symptoms during and following acute exercise, suggestive of what we now really call post-exertional malaise, but also dysregulation of central pain processing. And we wanted to do this same type of research in Gulf War veterans. And so this first study I'm going to show you, we looked at the effects of 30 minutes of cycling exercise at 70% of their peak aerobic capacity, which is a pretty robust stimulus, on their naturally occurring leg muscle pain that occurred during exercise, how hard it was for them to exercise, and then their sensitivity to heat pain stimuli. And so these are the results of during exercise. So on the y-axis here, we have pain from 0 to 10. We're measuring their pain ratings every 5 minutes during the 30-minute exercise task. And you can clearly see that Gulf War veterans with chronic musculoskeletal pain, CMP here, are reporting more pain in their exercising legs than the healthy Gulf War veterans. Similarly, RPE is ratings of their perceived exertion. Again, we're measuring these every 5 minutes during exercise, and you see that it required more effort for the Gulf War veterans with chronic musculoskeletal pain to complete the exercise, even though they were exercising at the same relative intensity as the healthy Gulf veterans. On the right here is from the same study. We were looking at their sensitivity to heat stimuli, and we use what are called descriptor differential scales. And this requires the veteran to tell us how unpleasant, annoying, distressing, and intolerable the pain is across 12 descriptors. We measured these pre-exercise and then immediate post-exercise and found large changes, sometimes double the amount of unpleasantness or just how distressing it was or how intolerable it was. On the left here, not so much in chronic pain only, but in Gulf War illness, I just wanted to demonstrate that what we also see is in a similar protocol at 70% of their heart rate reserve for 30 minutes, we measured symptom worsening pre to post exercise. So we did what is called a post-exertional malaise score, taking the worst symptom change that we saw for each veteran, both controls and those with Gulf War illness, and then calculating a change score. And what we see are large effect size of 1.65 change increases in symptoms for Gulf War illness, but not controls. In this same study where we were looking at Gulf War illness, we also measured their gene expression across several genes. And what we found was opposite of what we hypothesized. We hypothesized that they would show an increase in gene expression that would be associated with their symptoms. Instead, we found that decreases in those with Gulf War illness at 30 minutes and 24 hours post-exercise that was not seen in healthy. So in red, we have the Gulf War ill. In blue, we have the healthy controls. And we found decreases in the beta-actin, the CO-methyltransferase, and the toll-like receptor 4 genes for receptors for those genes in the Gulf War ill. Just as beta-actin, COMT, and TLR4 do lots of different things, but their relevance to Gulf War illness, beta-actin is involved in cell receptor motility and has been found to be associated with neurocognitive mood and GI symptoms when it becomes dysregulated. COMT is primarily involved in catecholamine degradation. It's been associated with impaired spatial orientation, depression, anxiety, and pain transmission. And then TLR4 is a pro-inflammatory mediator that has been associated with pain and cardiovascular function. And so we see these changes in the opposite direction from what we hypothesized, but in previous research had been associated with symptoms that are relevant to Gulf War illness. So from this acute exercise work, we found that acute sub-maximal exercise can worsen symptoms. It can enhance central nervous system sensitivity to sensory stimuli and alter gene expression for receptors involved in immune and metabolic processes. And all of these are opposite of what you would see in a healthy individual. However, our changes in gene expression did not mediate or explain the symptom responses. So something else was causing those symptom responses. Okay, transitioning to our cross-sectional work looking at brains of Gulf War veterans. My doctoral student, Stephanie Van Riper, in 2017, published our first structural study. We had done several functional neuroimaging studies, but here we're looking at white matter health or white matter microstructure. And we found that Gulf War veterans with chronic musculoskeletal pain show reduced white matter integrity. And I'll show you in a moment how that's associated with their pain symptoms. And so here we're looking at the directionality of water along the white matter tracks, and it becomes more constrained and unidirectional when there is healthy myelin that surrounds the white matter tract, or when there's the absence of neural inflammation. What we found, for example, were higher MD and RD, that's mean diffusivity and radio diffusivity, indicating higher levels of inflammation and lower degrees of myelination in Gulf War veterans with chronic musculoskeletal pain compared to healthy Gulf War veterans. And here we see a strong correlation between the white matter health. Here we're showing fractional anisotropy, mean FA. Higher numbers on this are better, meaning the water is tracking the white matter tract more linearly, and associated with their fibromyalgia impact total score. So as their white matter health gets worse, in other words, a reduction in the mean FA, sorry about that, mean FA value, their fibromyalgia impact score got worse. So worse white matter health, worse pain. We also recently, my other doctoral student, Jacob Ninneman, published a study showing that Gulf War veterans show differences in gray matter volume. We found that they had smaller insular cortex volumes, an area that's heavily involved in pain regulation, and larger pre, mid, and occipital, and frontal cortices. So a larger frontal cortex volumes, and these areas are involved in both pain perception and pain amplification. And here are just the relationships with the insular cortex volume. So here we're measuring the bodily pain using the SF36. And so lower scores are worse pain. And so we have smaller volumes in the left and right insula are associated with worse pain or greater pain interfering in their lives. So in summary, from our cross-sectional work, Gulf War veterans with chronic musculoskeletal pain show worse white matter microstructure, so worse white matter health, smaller brain volumes in regions involved in pain modulation, and larger brain volumes in regions involved in pain perception and amplification. And importantly, these differences that we see in brain morphology were associated with the veterans' pain reports. So what we learned from our acute exercise models and what we were seeing in our brain imaging really stimulated us to design a randomized controlled trial. In this case, because we are exercise scientists, this was a chronic exercise training randomized controlled trial with the aims of first determining its safety and efficacy. And so we were very wary of post-exertional malaise, and we wanted to see whether or not the acute exercise responses would be reflected in chronic exercise training. And so we measured the patient global impression of change, as well as looked at lots of safety markers. We also wanted to look at resistance exercise training on their pain, their physical activity levels. That would be aim 2. And then finally, in aim 3, we wanted to look whether or not resistance exercise training affected their brain structure. So this would be their brain white matter tracts, and not written here, also their gray matter volumes. And so our first study that we published on this was in 2021 on the safety and efficacy of the short-term resistance exercise program. I'm going to go through the background of this, and then I'll show some of the safety and efficacy data. So we recruited 54 Gulf War veterans from the first Persian Gulf War, age range 35 to 65. They had to have 3 or more body quadrants of pain for at least 3 months. They had it for many, many years in our trial. It had to be medically unexplained and occur post-deployment. And several of our veterans met criteria for fibromyalgia as well, although that was not inclusionary or exclusionary. This is just the protocol. We would bring them in, we'd screen them, make sure that they met our inclusion criteria. We would then fill out lots of questionnaires. We would then bring them in for their baseline MRI and their baseline physical activity assessment. So we'd collect both self-report and a week's worth of accelerometer data. We would then randomize them to either 16 weeks of resistance exercise training or weightless control. And then at weeks 5, 10, and 16, we would measure their physical activity for the week. And weeks 6, 11, and 17, we bring them in for their MRI scan and questionnaire filling out. And then not shown here, we followed them up at 6 months and 1 year later. So for our resistance exercise training, we did 90 minutes of resistance exercise training 2 days a week. It was standardized, progressive, and individualized. Standardized in that we did all 10 body parts. We did the exact same sets and reps with folks. It was progressive in that we had a progressive and standardized in the sense of how much we increased weight when they could complete the reps with good form. And it was individualized based on their initial strength. And so we did 10 whole body exercises. We started at a very low percentage of their 1 rep max, 25% for upper body, 35% for lower body, which was quite easy for the veterans to do, but we really wanted to avoid exacerbating their symptoms if we could. Each training volume was 1 warm-up set, 10 to 15 reps by 2 sets. And if they could complete 15 reps with good form, and do that for 2 sets, then we would increase by 5 pounds for upper body and 10 pounds for lower body. These are just to show you the subject characteristics. They were well matched on age, height, weight, their baseline pain, their baseline total mood disturbance as measured by the profile of mood states, their baseline fatigue as measured by the multidimensional fatigue inventory, their baseline sleep quality as by the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and the weightless control were moderately more active at baseline, but not significantly so compared to the resistance exercise training. So here we have on the left their maximal exercise test. So we did this at baseline at week 16 and at week 8 and week 16. And I'm showing you the changes from baseline to the final week of training. And what we saw were large increases in strength for leg press, moderate for chest press, large for leg, and on and on. So we saw moderate to large increases in strength for all their lifts. On the right is their training volume progression. So this is how much weight they were moving at each training session. And you can see a nice steady increase over time throughout throughout here to 25 sessions. They attended 28 out of 32 sessions. So that was very good attendance, 87% adherence, and we had no serious adverse events. We did have muscle soreness, which you would expect. And of course, the veterans were in chronic pain already, but we had no serious adverse events to the exercise training. Here we're showing the global impression of change ratings going from 0 to 7. A 2 on this scale is no change. And the Gulf War veterans in the resistance exercise training, 15 out of 24 reported somewhat to definitely improved, while the controls, 18 of the veterans reported no change. And so we had a improvement in their perceived disease status, their perceived health. But here we have pain and their daily physical activity. Those did not change throughout the trial. So no major changes in their pain ratings, even at out to 17 weeks and at 6 and 12 months. And they maintained their total physical activity status. And so what I would stress about these two things is, one is pain didn't get worsened by chronic exercise training, unlike what we see with acute exercise. And no change in their daily physical activity means that the veterans in the resistance exercise training program were more active 90 minutes per week. And so this daily physical activity is what's occurring outside of the lab, not including the 90 minutes of resistance exercise training. So they're actually becoming more active because they're not reducing their physical activity during the week. We also measured their mood at each training session. And so here we have from baseline to 16 weeks. This is the profile of mood states anxiety scale. And we saw a significant group by time interaction that was characterized by a steady reduction in anxious mood in veterans in the resistance exercise training group, and pretty much no change for the weightless controls. We saw this same pattern for depression or depressed mood, which with a greater overall effect in the resistance exercise training group. And we saw the same pattern for angry mood. And so we saw decreases in anxious, depressed, and angry mood across the 16 weeks of training. In addition, we looked at their pain sensitivity. Again, all of this was informed by our earlier acute exercise work. So we looked at their effects of the resistance exercise training on 45, 47, and 49 degrees Celsius. So that's a light, a moderate, and a strong painful stimulus. We saw no effect at 45 or 49 degrees. Mostly they were rating 0 at 45, and 49 they were rating very high on the scale. It's a pretty robust stimulus. But at 47 degrees, we saw that both groups decreased they increased to week 5 and then decreased all throughout to week 17. But there was no group group or group by time interaction effects. So we can't attribute this to exercise training. And finally, we looked at brain structure. And so across the 16 weeks of exercise, not shown here, including the 6 and 12 months, we saw no change in their white matter integrity. So we did not see what we hypothesized would be an increase in white matter health. We did not see that change. And so here I'm showing you just for radial diffusivity. Red is weightless control, black is resistance exercise training. You see a pretty flat line across their radial diffusivity values. The same was for mean diffusivity and fractional anisotropy and axial diffusivity for that matter. And we saw no changes in either total or regional gray matter volume. And so when we controlled for all of our multiple testing within the gray matter volume, we did this at what's called a voxel-wise level. We saw no significant difference between groups in their no significant change over time in either group in their gray matter volumes. And so overall conclusions, chronic widespread pain and post-exertional malaise are very complex, and they affect a large number of Gulf War veterans. I think that has become clear throughout this conference. Acute exercise can definitely worsen symptoms and differentially impact many biological systems. I think that is clear in the literature. However, chronic exercise is different, especially done at a low intensity, and could be an important adjunct treatment for Gulf War veterans with chronic pain. And so I want to make sure that I'm clear, is that's with Gulf veterans with chronic pain. We have not done an exercise training trial, except for the first one that was done in the 90s in Gulf War illness. Overall, we need more research that tests the mechanisms of how exercise works and the neurobiology that might underlie its treatment effects if it's there. This is my lab on the left, our funders, and I want to give a shout out for some of the data today from my colleagues at the War-Related Illness and Injury Study Center and their PI, Mike Falvo. And of course, I want to thank all the Gulf War veteran volunteers for over all the years that we've worked together to try to understand this complex disease. With that, I thank you for your time.
Dane, thank you for an outstanding talk. That was excellent.